Hello. When we analyze the derivative works right, we always want to ask whether some other right is also involved, usually the reproduction right, although the legislative history points out that the public performance right may be implicated on occasion. The distinction between reproduction and derivative works rights can be confusing or non existent, as we saw in our discussion of subject matter. There are three main reasons to study derivative works separately. First, there's some situations where the derivative works right is the only plausible right being infringed. You need to be able to recognize that, though this situation is rare. That Venn diagram is not to scale. In fact, there may at most be a thin rind on the derivative work only side. Still, sometimes it may be plausible that a derivative work has been created without making a copy or engaging in a public performance or display. For example, by taking a pre-existing authorized copy and recasting it in some way. So a collage that is never displayed in public. The broad policy question that we're left with, given the reality that that's actually a pretty thin rind indeed, is should we use the derivative works right to fill in gaps of copyright control left by the other rights, or do those gaps exist for a reason? Second, there are situations where the derivative works right is an easier way to explain why a use is infringing than simply invoking substantial similarity. So if you think about why a translation is substantially similar to the same book in another language, or why a book is substantially similar to a movie, derivative works language offers you a shortcut conceptually. I've argued that this overlap is a mistake and that we should generally distinguish between reproductions, which should be limited to basically pure reproductions, and derivative works. So if the reproduction is not exact, we should not be talking about the reproduction right, but courts have very much gone the other way. Third, an appropriate definition of the derivative works right could help us explain why some things that shouldn't be found to infringe don't infringe if they are neither pure reproductions nor derivative works. So if we examine the definition of a derivative work, we see that the touchstone of the derivative works right is some sort of recasting or transformation. The dominant interpretation of that is that something original has to be added to the pre-existing material. So the reference to art reproduction does not mean that the slides that we considered in Corel are copyrightable because they lack the requisite originality. Several explanations for the right have been offered. Goldstein argues that it allows division of investment and direction of resources into the most productive works. It's economically efficient to allow Warner Brothers to manage the Harry Potter movies while J.K. Rowling retains the right to write future sequels in book form. It tilts investment towards licensable properties, which may contribute to the primacy of sequels and franchises in modern American culture. There's an open question whether this is a good idea. Is it a violation of non-discrimination to have a system that guides investment towards things that are more likely to produce valuable derivative works like dolls or t-shirts? Or is it just a natural consequence of incentives? Pam Samuelson takes a more conceptual approach. She argues that we should use statutory interpretation to figure out the kinds of things that are derivative works. She groups the categories into shorter versions of originals, faithful renditions in a different language or format, that would be book to movie, and new works that transform an existing work from one medium to another or from one genre to another. She argues that the rationales for the derivative works right support giving rights only in foreseeable markets. Goldstein's investment justification requires some sort of foresight, as does the idea that the original author is best positioned to exploit additional markets. So consider whether you think the cases that we look at in this section involve foreseeable uses. When the works are of different genres, though, it may be easier to ask whether there's a derivative work than whether there's substantial similarity, and Samuelson's characterizations reflect that. The aesthetic appeal of the movie is unlikely to be the same in the ordinary meaning of aesthetic appeal, that is the intrinsic part of the substantial similarity test, but we may still believe that there's a fundamental continuity that justifies giving rights to the author of the book. In that sense, the derivative works right helps expand the scope of copyright beyond substantial similarity between works, although maybe we're now talking about substantial similarity between sufficient parts of works as sufficient. So we will explore these questions more in class. I will see you then. Thank you.